Welcome to the duplicate lecture for September 24th. This is the lecture that was supposed to be given on September 24th, and I'm going to give it to you by video. I suggest that you follow along with the slides and take notes. You've got the slides posted on your Blackboard site. The lecture will run through slide 13, and I will finish the lecture up next week. So I'm going to move now from the title slide for the lecture to slide number 2 in the lecture notes. And this has to do with the status of literacy in the time that Plato and Aristotle lived and the transition from a purely oral culture to a culture where people could read. This was a very important transition. It's similar in dimensions to the development of electronic and digital media in the 20th century that had such a profound effect on society. So at that time, Greek society was moving to a literate culture, but the technologies for literacy were quite primitive, which meant that there wasn't, like, you can't imagine a lot of books being distributed widely because they didn't have paper that could be used to print the books on. They used instead for writing technologies things like stone, clay, wood, and wax, and papyrus. Most of these were media in which the writing was inscribed or engraved, since they were not paper. So Greek society prior to that time had been grounded in a tradition of oral presentation and performance, as illustrated in the presentation of Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey. The traditions of the culture were inscribed in these long poems and recitations, but we know that there was a strong tradition of speech making because the Iliad and the Odyssey themselves contain rhetorical speeches and show that people were practicing rhetoric prior to the time of literacy. Writing such as it existed at that time was used largely for record keeping related to business transactions, but the rest of the communications in the society, other than business related, were largely oral. The main site in which this oral communication occurred had to do with legal pleadings and public deliberations. There was a widespread increase in democracy after 400 BC, and so legal pleadings and deliberations were done through the work of citizens and just plain citizens, rather than through lawyers, as we might imagine today, or through the use of judges, and I will talk a little bit more about that later. So there's a very strong oral culture there, and a prominent classicist, George Kennedy, notes that at that time, even when a Greek person was reading to himself, he read out loud. So strong tradition of oral culture. Moving on to slide 3, we'll talk about the concerns about the move to literacy by some of the philosophers and scholars at that time, one of whom was Plato, which will be the first author we will read. There was a lot of anxiety about the move to literacy. Would the advent of writing destroy memory? At that time, memory was a very important skill for people to have because it was the way in which culture and its traditions were stored. And if writing came into vogue, Plato was concerned that that would impair people's memory, which is not a misplaced concern, which we will discuss later in this section of the course. Would the advent of writing lead to the loss of tradition and culture? In other words, would the fact that a part of what was going on was written down mean that the other parts of what was going on would not be preserved? And there was a real concern about that. There was also a concern that the great sagas and stories of Greek history would be lost. Fortunately, we still have the Iliad and the Odyssey today, and they preserved a large part of the culture, and we have them in written form. But this was a legitimate concern at the time. And then, as you will see, Plato argues in Phaedrus that writing something down is not acceptable because there is no opportunity for interaction or exchange or opportunity to respond to questions and challenges. So the concern about a lack of interactivity is quite justified, and people still can see validity in that argument at the present time. Moving on to slide 4, I'd like to talk about some of the technologies of writing and some of the results of this transition. Many of the treatises of Greek culture have been lost. And if we were in class, I would ask you, how do you think they were lost? And there are many ways in which they were lost. First of all, the materials on which writing was transcribed were quite fragile, as I've already mentioned. Secondly, the largest library in the ancient world, the library at Alexandria, was burned down. And when it was burned down, with it went all of the books and papyruses that had been stored there. So a great deal of the written texts were lost at that time. Also, some works were destroyed or suppressed by the church, who did not want them circulating among the common people. Thirdly, you have the challenge of translation, and this slide 4 illustrates a very important object. And in class, I ask each year, who knows what this is? And in class, each year, at least one person knows what this is. It is the Rosetta Stone, which is a tablet, a basalt tablet, which presently exists in the British Library. It's a basalt slab discovered by French soldiers in 1799. It contains 3 parallel inscriptions of the same text, one in Egyptian, one in Demotic, and one in Greek. It's 3 transcriptions, again, of the same text. So when this stone was actually discovered, by placing the Greek, which was a known language by the people at the time who discovered it, in relation to the other 2 ancient languages, it became possible to now understand what the hieroglyphs and some of the materials that people had been unable to decode to ascertain what they actually had on them. So if you're ever in London, you should go to the British Library and see the Rosetta Stone. It's a very fascinating object. I would like to move on now to the sophists' role in Greek society.